The streets of Manhattan were alive with the hum of ambition and endless traffic. A city that never whispered, it roared. But in a luxury penthouse overlooking Central Park, the sound of heels clicking furiously across the polished floor echoed louder than the city itself. "Where are my earrings?" Elise Carter's voice was sharp, slicing through the sleek silence of their home. Her husband, Daniel Carter, a successful real estate magnate, looked up from his tablet with mild irritation. He was sitting at the marble kitchen island, sipping his espresso, dressed impeccably as always in a tailored navy suit. "Which ones?" he asked without looking away from the financial forecast on his screen. "The diamond studs, the ones you bought me in Paris." Elise stormed past him, her manicured nails brushing against her designer handbag. She was frantic but still stunning. Wavy brunette hair, high cheekbones, and eyes that could smolder or freeze depending on her mood. Daniel set the tablet down and stood, slowly walking toward her. "Relax. We have 10 minutes before the car arrives." He placed a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged him off. "I can't believe this," she muttered. "I told you I hate being late." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "The Met Gala isn't exactly going to start without us." Elise shot him a glare before heading into their bedroom. Daniel sighed and followed, but something caught his eye by the front door. A small glint of metal on the console table. The missing earrings. "Elise, they're right here," he called out. Her heels came to an abrupt halt. She reappeared at the doorway, her face momentarily softening with relief. "Thank God." She took the earrings and fastened them as Daniel handed her a glass of champagne. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You can breathe now." Elise took a long sip. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I just want everything to be perfect tonight." Daniel leaned in and kissed her cheek, catching a faint whiff of her perfume. Jasmine and vanilla, the scent of countless memories. "It will be," he said, although deep down, he knew things hadn't felt perfect in a long time. The driver arrived precisely at 8 p.m. The car was a sleek black SUV, polished to a mirror shine. At the wheel was Marcus Hayes, their personal driver for the past 3 years. Marcus was in his early 30s, with sharp features, piercing hazel eyes, and an air of quiet confidence. He always seemed to know exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. "Good evening, Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter," Marcus greeted them as he opened the back door. Elise offered a brief but dazzling smile as she slid into the leather seat. Daniel followed, but not before catching the subtle glance that passed between his wife and Marcus. A moment so brief that anyone else would have missed it, but Daniel didn't. His stomach tightened. The drive was uneventful, but Daniel noticed Elise's body language, how she kept adjusting her hair and checking her reflection in the tinted window. When Marcus spoke to her, even casually asking about the evening's plans, she laughed a little too warmly. By the time they arrived at the gala, Daniel's instincts were buzzing with an unspoken warning. The red carpet flashbulbs went off like fireworks, but Daniel's smile felt painted on as they posed for photos. Elise shone under the attention, her laughter bright and effortless. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere beneath the surface, the cracks in their perfect world had begun to spread. Hours later, the gala was winding down, and Daniel watched Elise from across the room as she chatted with a group of designers. She looked radiant in her champagne-colored gown, but there was something distant about her, as if she wasn't really there. "Daniel." She waved him over, her expression glowing. "We're leaving soon, right?" Daniel nodded and signaled Marcus, who was waiting at the entrance. The driver moved with practiced ease, polite but almost too attentive as he guided Elise out to the car. The ride back was quiet, filled with an unspoken tension that hung like smoke. When they reached their building, Daniel turned to Marcus. "I'll take it from here." Marcus nodded and stepped aside, though Daniel didn't miss the way his wife's gaze lingered a second too long. As they entered the elevator, Daniel finally spoke. "Elise, is there something you need to tell me?" She blinked, caught off guard. "What? No. Why would you ask that?" "Just a feeling," Daniel replied coolly. Elise laughed, but it was too thin, too brittle. "You're being paranoid." The elevator doors opened, and they walked into their penthouse. Elise slipped off her heels and poured herself another glass of champagne. Daniel watched her silently, his mind replaying every detail. The glances, the laughter, the way she leaned just slightly toward Marcus. "I think we should talk," he said finally. Elise sighed, clearly tired. "Daniel, not tonight." His voice was calm, but his gaze was steely. "Soon, Elise. We're going to talk?" She nodded, but the flicker of unease in her eyes betrayed her. And as Daniel turned away, he knew one thing for certain. The perfect life they had built was on the edge of something dangerous. And the fall was coming. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the penthouse, but it did nothing to lift the weight hanging in the air. Daniel woke early, as he always did, slipping out of bed without disturbing Elise. She was still asleep, wrapped in the silk sheets, her breathing steady but shallow. He made his way to the kitchen and prepared his espresso, the familiar hum of the machine grounding him. But his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a labyrinth of suspicion. By the time Elise stirred and wandered into the room, barefoot in one of his shirts, Daniel was already seated at the breakfast nook, reading the paper. He glanced up as she walked in, though his expression was guarded. "Good morning," she greeted softly, her voice still laced with sleep. Daniel folded the newspaper slowly. "Morning." Elise poured herself a cup of coffee and took a seat across from him, studying his face. "You're quiet." He shrugged, feigning indifference. "Just tired." Her eyes narrowed slightly as though she sensed the lie, but chose not to press further. "I was thinking, maybe we should take a trip after the holidays. Somewhere warm." Daniel took a sip of his coffee, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe." The moment stretched between them, heavy with the things left unsaid. Later that afternoon, Daniel's schedule was packed with meetings, but his mind kept drifting back to the night before. The stolen glances, the tightness in Elise's smile, and the easy familiarity she shared with Marcus. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong. By lunchtime, he couldn't resist any longer. He called his assistant and canceled his remaining appointments for the day. Instead, he drove across town to an exclusive private investigator's office in Midtown. The receptionist, a sleek woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, led him into a minimalist office with floor-to-ceiling windows. A man in a tailored suit stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Carter, I'm Alex Reed." Daniel shook his hand firmly and took a seat. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice." Alex nodded, his expression serious. "Of course. What can I do for you?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I need you to look into my wife and our driver." Alex's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't ask questions. He simply opened a leather-bound notebook and clicked his pen. "Names? Elise Carter. Marcus Hayes." Alex scribbled down the names. "Do you have any suspicions you'd like to share?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "She's been distant for months. And last night, I saw things that didn't sit right." Alex nodded again, his gaze steady. "Understood. I'll be discreet. These things can be painful, but if there's anything there, I'll find it." Daniel exhaled slowly, the knot in his chest loosening, just slightly. "That's all I ask." For the next few days, Daniel threw himself into work, trying to drown out the anxiety gnawing at him. But every evening when he returned home, he noticed the subtle changes in Elise. The way her phone was always face down, the way she avoided meeting his eyes for too long. Marcus continued to drive them as though nothing had changed. But Daniel saw through the mask of professionalism. Every small courtesy, the polite smile, the perfect timing, felt like a charade. One night, as they returned home from an investor's dinner, Elise fell asleep in the car. Daniel watched her for a long moment before shifting his gaze to the rearview mirror. Marcus's eyes met his for a fraction of a second before darting away. The tension between the two men was palpable. When they reached the penthouse, Daniel gently shook Elise awake. She yawned and stretched before stepping out of the car. Daniel lingered behind, closing the car door deliberately. "Marcus," he said, his voice low. The driver turned, surprised. "Yes, Mr. Carter?" Daniel stepped closer, his tone deceptively calm. "You've worked for us for 3 years. I trusted you." Marcus's face remained impassive, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I appreciate that trust, sir." Daniel's eyes bore into him. Let's hope it wasn't misplaced. Marcus nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Of course. Daniel stepped back and walked toward the elevator, his heart pounding in his chest. The next morning, Daniel received a call from Alex Reed. His voice was calm but direct. I found something. We need to meet. Daniel's blood ran cold as he scheduled the meeting. The words reverberated in his mind long after the call ended. Whatever truth Alex had uncovered, Daniel knew one thing for certain. It would change everything. The city skyline was shrouded in gray as Daniel stepped into Alex Reed's office later that afternoon. The investigator's face was unreadable, but the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Alex motioned for Daniel to sit before sliding a folder across the desk. Daniel hesitated for a brief second, then flipped it open. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the photos, grainy but unmistakable. The first showed Elise stepping out of the penthouse in a sleek black dress. The next was taken outside a hotel Daniel didn't recognize. Marcus was standing by the entrance, holding the door open for her. And then came the image that sent a jolt of fire through his veins. Elise and Marcus in the hallway of the hotel, standing too close, her hand brushing his cheek. Daniel's jaw tightened as Alex spoke quietly. This has been going on for months. They meet at the Royale Hotel downtown. Discreet, mid-tier, not flashy enough to raise suspicion. Daniel closed the folder slowly, his fingers trembling. Did you get the full timeline? Alex nodded. It started about 8 months ago. Small things at first, longer rides home, late-night errands. Then it escalated. I can confirm multiple meetings over the past 3 months. Daniel felt his composure cracking like glass under pressure. How did I not see this sooner? Alex's gaze was sympathetic but firm. Because you trusted her. Daniel stood abruptly, unable to sit still as rage and betrayal coursed through him. I need time to process this, he muttered. Alex nodded. Take whatever time you need. But if you want to act on this, you'll need to be strategic. Daniel met his gaze, a dangerous resolve settling over him. I'll be in touch. Back at the penthouse, Elise was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled as Daniel walked in. Hey, you're home early. Daniel forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Meetings wrapped up sooner than expected. He kissed her on the cheek, his mind burning with the images from the folder. Every word she said felt like poison wrapped in honey. How about dinner at that new place on 5th? Elise suggested. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. Sounds perfect. Over the next few days, Daniel played the role of a loving husband perfectly. He acted as if everything was normal, but every glance at Elise felt like a test of his restraint. He watched her subtle movements, the way she checked her phone, the absent-minded tapping of her fingers when she thought he wasn't looking. The plan forming in Daniel's mind was ruthless. He wouldn't confront her head-on. No, he would dismantle her world the way she had shattered his. One evening, Daniel invited Marcus up to the penthouse after driving them home. Elise's face tensed as Marcus stepped inside, his usual confident demeanor faltering. Marcus, Daniel said, pouring 3 glasses of bourbon. Join us for a drink. Marcus hesitated, but took the glass. Thank you, sir. Daniel clinked his glass against Marcus's and Elise's, his smile unnervingly calm. To loyalty. Elise's fingers twitched, but she forced a smile. Marcus sipped his drink, though his eyes darted nervously between them. Daniel took a slow sip, savoring the silence before speaking again. Marcus, have you ever thought about what trust really means? The driver's grip tightened around the glass. Of course, sir. Daniel set his glass down, his eyes locked on Marcus. Good. Because trust, once broken, has a way of coming back to haunt people. Elise set her drink down abruptly. I think I'm going to bed. Daniel didn't stop her, his focus unwavering. He waited until she disappeared down the hall before leaning closer to Marcus. His voice was low, deadly. You're done. Marcus blinked, his composure slipping. Sir. Daniel's smile vanished. You betrayed me. You betrayed this family. And I'm going to make sure you regret it. Marcus paled, but Daniel stood and opened the front door. Leave. Now. Marcus hesitated for only a second before placing his glass down and walking out, his shoulders hunched. The door clicked shut behind him. Daniel exhaled slowly and headed toward the bedroom. Elise was already under the covers, her back to him. He lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, knowing that the next steps would be crucial. He hadn't just uncovered a betrayal, he had declared war. The morning after Marcus was dismissed, the atmosphere in the penthouse was stifling, like the calm before a storm. Elise moved through the motions of her day, but there was a brittle quality to her actions, an air of someone who knew the world beneath her feet was beginning to crumble. Daniel, however, was unervingly calm. He had breakfast prepared when she entered the kitchen, eggs, toast, and freshly brewed coffee. He smiled at her, the same disarming smile that masked 1,000 unspoken thoughts. "Good morning," he said. Elise hesitated before responding. "Morning." She sat down and reached for her coffee, her hand trembling slightly. Daniel noticed but said nothing. Instead, he poured himself another cup and sat across from her. "I've been thinking," he said smoothly, stirring his coffee. "Maybe we should take some time off. A trip somewhere. Just us." Elise's eyes widened, and for a moment, guilt flickered behind them. "That sounds nice." Daniel's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. I'll make the arrangements." That afternoon, Elise's unease grew. Marcus hadn't returned any of her messages, and the absence of his usual, dependable presence left her feeling unmoored. She wandered from room to room, feeling Daniel's eyes on her whenever she passed. His silence was louder than any accusation. By evening, she couldn't take it anymore. As they sat in the living room, Daniel reading a book and Elise pretending to scroll through her phone, she finally spoke. "Where's Marcus?" she asked, her voice strained but steady. Daniel closed his book deliberately and set it aside. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Gone." Elise's breath caught in her throat. "Gone? What do you mean?" "I mean he no longer works for us." Daniel's voice was calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Elise's mind raced. She felt the walls closing in. "Why? What happened?" Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I think you know exactly what happened." Her face paled, and she shook her head weakly. "Daniel, it's not what you think." He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Not what I think. Elise, I've seen the photos. I know everything." Tears welled in Elise's eyes. "Please, let me explain." Daniel stood, looming over her. "Explain what? That you've been sneaking around with the man I trusted to drive us? To protect you? To protect our family?" Elise sobbed openly now, her composure shattered. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper, more dangerous than any shout. "But it did." Elise fell to her knees, clutching his hand. "I love you, Daniel. Please, we can fix this." He stared down at her, his expression cold, unmovable. "Love? You call this love?" He pulled his hand away as though her touch burned him. The silence stretched unbearably before he spoke again, his tone measured and devoid of emotion. "We're done, Elise." She gasped. "No, please. I've already contacted my lawyers. There will be no public spectacle. You'll get a settlement, more than you deserve, but this marriage is over." Elise broke down completely, her cries echoing through the vast room. The next day, Elise moved out. Daniel didn't watch her go. He couldn't bear to. He stayed in his office as the movers packed her things. When the door finally closed behind her for the last time, the silence that followed was deafening. But Daniel wasn't finished. 2 weeks later, Marcus's name made the headlines. An anonymous tip had led to the revelation of his inappropriate relationships with multiple clients during his time as a driver for other high-profile families. The scandal spread like wildfire. By the time it was over, Marcus's career, and any semblance of a reputable future, was in ashes. Daniel watched it unfold with an unsettling calm. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about taking back control. Months passed. The penthouse was redecorated, the memories scrubbed away like a fresh coat of paint over a scarred wall. Daniel rebuilt his life piece by piece. He focused on his business, reconnected with friends he distanced himself from, and started attending charity events solo. One evening, as he stood on the balcony overlooking the shimmering lights of Manhattan, he felt an unfamiliar peace. The anger, the betrayal, it no longer consumed him. A knock at the door broke his reverie. He turned, surprised to see a familiar face. Alex Reed. The investigator handed him a small envelope. Thought you should know. She's staying in the Hamptons. Alone. Daniel nodded, taking the envelope but not opening it. Thank you. Alex hesitated before adding, You did what you had to do. Daniel smiled faintly. Yes, I did. As Alex left, Daniel walked back inside, placing the envelope on the counter. He didn't need to read it. Some chapters didn't need revisiting. Instead, he poured himself a glass of bourbon, the same drink he had once shared with Marcus. He raised the glass to the skyline and whispered, To loyalty. Then he drank, the past finally fading as the city lights twinkled around him. Spring arrived in Manhattan with blossoms and soft breezes, but for Daniel Carter, it marked the season of resolution. The penthouse was no longer haunted by memories. It was filled with the quiet hum of progress. He had rebuilt his world from the ruins of betrayal, but the scars were still there, invisible but permanent. It had been 3 months since Elise moved out and Marcus's reputation was obliterated by scandal. Daniel had done what he promised. He reclaimed control. Yet, in the quiet hours of the morning, he would sometimes wonder if victory had come at too high a price. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel stood in his minimalist living room, the hum of a jazz record filling the space. A knock at the door broke the stillness. He opened it to find Elise standing there, pale but composed, wearing a beige trench coat. Daniel, she said softly. He stepped aside without a word. She walked in, looking around the room as if absorbing all the changes. The new furniture, the different artwork. It was all unfamiliar to her now. You redecorated, she murmured. I had to, Daniel replied, his voice steady. Elise turned to face him, eyes brimming with emotion. I didn't come to beg or ask for anything. I needed to apologize. Not in texts or emails. In person. Daniel crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. Go on. Tears threatened to spill down Elise's cheeks, but she held her composure. I was selfish. I let my insecurities destroy everything we built. I betrayed you in the worst way. She took a shaky breath. But despite it all, I never stopped loving you. Daniel's face remained unreadable, but inside, her words reopened wounds he thought had healed. He waited a long moment before responding. Love isn't enough, Elise. Not after what you did. She nodded, as if she'd expected this. I know, but I needed you to hear it. The silence between them stretched out. Then Daniel finally spoke, his voice softer than before. What are you going to do now? I'm moving to California, Elise said. A fresh start. Maybe it's what we both need. Daniel felt an unexpected pang of sadness. Despite everything, she had been a significant part of his life. But he knew this was for the best. I hope you find peace, he said quietly. She offered him a small, genuine smile. I hope you do too. She turned and walked to the door. Just as she reached it, she paused and looked back one last time. Goodbye, Daniel. Goodbye, Elise. The door closed behind her, and Daniel stood there for a moment, letting the finality of it settle. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, business deals, and travel. Daniel kept moving forward, refusing to dwell on the past. But something shifted in him after Elise's visit, a sense of closure that hadn't existed before. One evening, Daniel attended a charity gala hosted by an influential art foundation. The room was filled with New York's elite, laughter and conversation echoing against the gilded ceilings. As Daniel sipped his champagne, he noticed a woman standing alone near the gallery entrance. She was striking, dark hair, sharp features, and a quiet confidence that stood out in the crowd. She caught him looking and smiled, a subtle but warm gesture. Daniel hesitated for a moment before walking over. Hi, I'm Daniel. She extended her hand. Lena, nice to meet you. The conversation flowed easily, surprising him. They talked about art, travel, and the city's best hidden spots. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Daniel felt something stir, a spark of possibility. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel and Lena began seeing each other regularly. She was different from Elise, grounded, honest, and unafraid of vulnerability. Daniel found himself laughing more, rediscovering the joy in small moments. One evening, as they watched the sunset from his balcony, Lena turned to him. "Do you ever think about the past?" Daniel's gaze lingered on the horizon before he answered. "I used to, but now, I think about the future." Lena smiled and leaned into him, her presence steady and reassuring. On a crisp autumn morning a year after Elise had left, Daniel found himself back at the same balcony, coffee in hand. The city stretched out before him, vibrant and alive. He thought about how far he'd come, not just in terms of success, but in healing. The past had taught him about loss, betrayal, and resilience, but it had also shown him the value of self-worth and the importance of letting go. Daniel raised his coffee cup to the skyline and whispered, "To new beginnings." As the sun bathed the city in golden light, he felt it fully, the weight of the past lifting, leaving room for something new. End of story.